Newcomers to Canada face a lot of hurdles and challenges, all of which are made more difficult if they don't speak the local language, or if the services they need to access aren't available in their language. In many cases in Canada, even newcomers who speak French have difficulty finding someone with whom they can communicate. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. When Canadian newcomers face a language barrier, it often falls to their children, sometimes very young children, to bridge the gap at the bank, the doctor's office, or the grocery store. This is child language brokering, and it remains an understudied phenomenon. Our guests today have written a book that's helping to understand it a little bit more.
Hello everyone, my name is Katerina Palova. I am currently the manager of the Center for Immigrant Research at the Immigrant Education Society in Calgary. I am also an adjunct professor with the University of British Columbia Faculty of Education.
My name is Anusha. I'm an associate professor at the University of British Columbia, specifically in School and Applied Child Psychology. I'm joining you today from Calgary, which is where most of our research has been taking place between Ties, Katerina, and I. And I'm located on Treaty 7 territory and also Métis Nation Districts 5 and 6.
I want to talk to you about child language brokering. And before we even start to talk about the book that you guys have come out with, I want a definition of child language brokering, if that's possible.
Sure thing. I can jump in. Basically, when we talk about child language brokering, we talk about the process where children, who could be actual children, adolescents, young adults, are translating and interpreting for their parents, guardians, family members in an official capacity. And this can take place across multiple contexts, often educational, medical, legal spaces. And the language brokers, who are the youth translating for the adults, are not just brokering language, but they're also brokering culture as well, because folks are navigating an entirely different system post-immigration.
The research that you guys did was specifically with Arabic communities in Alberta. Am I right in thinking that?
We did our research with 3 different language groups. We did it in English, so those would be usually families whose first language is not English, but their English capacity is stronger, or their children would prefer to speak in English and do the interviews with us in English. The second language group would be French-speaking newcomers. And then the third group would be the Arabic ones. So we actually were able to capture three languages throughout the research.
So some of them are French language speaking people in Alberta. Is Alberta different than, my experience is Ontario, where you can pretty well get by in French just about anywhere in the Ottawa region, certainly. Is it a little bit different in Alberta?
I have so much to say, and I'm sure Anusha has so much to say as well. I will maybe start with a little bit. It's highly challenging for French-speaking people in general, not just newcomers, but also French-speaking Canadians to live in Alberta using French, because Alberta is truly English-speaking province, and getting services in French outside of the federal or official businesses is quite challenging. Maybe Anusha, you can add to that because you have personal experience.
Sure. I'm, born and raised in Montreal. And in my experience, the further west I have gone, the harder it has been for Francophone communities. In the case of our participants, we're talking about folks who speak French as a heritage language or often as a second language, and they're immigrating to Canada with the idea that the country is bilingual. But as Katerina explained, it's not really the case in Alberta. And often these families might be in French school systems, for example, where they can communicate with instructors in French. But then outside of that, the city is primarily Anglophone. So if they're going to the hospital, to the grocery store, big or small, there has to be some English language learning involved. And even though a lot of services are supposedly legally available to folks, we know that that's not always the case, because folks, for example, might have to wait at the hospital for an extra 8 to 10 hours to get someone to communicate with them in French. And so the complexity multiplies when you think of folks who need an interpreter or translator in a different language. And that's where the children often come in.
Just wanted to add that French is actually an amazing example because sometimes we hear stories about, oh, why children translate for their parents? They shouldn't be doing this, We're a bilingual country. But then the truth is that it's very challenging to get even the official language translation, right? French is official language here in Canada. And yet, as Anusha said, sometimes it's extra 8 hours of wait time. We had a client or a participant in the research who said she had to wait extra 3 weeks to get her results translated in French. So how can we navigate really the multicultural society if we struggle in English-speaking provinces to find interpretation and translation to support French-speaking families?
We did a podcast episode a little over a year ago with Kevin Prada, who was at the University of Manitoba, and specifically how difficult it was for LGBTQ people to find resources in French in Manitoba because they just didn't exist in the province, and trying to navigate that system became so much harder for them. And I imagine that this puts a lot of pressure on the kids to be with their parents whenever they have to go to any sort of, access any service, go to something more official, that the kids have to be with them, and it takes a lot of their time as well, right?
That's true. Sometimes they happen to be in the space, for example, at school, but oftentimes they have to take time to make a call with their parents or go visit a specific lawyer's office or doctor's office. And I think the concern, first of all, we should say there's very little research on this topic, I guess because it's so specific. But the research originally mostly focused on the challenges that's placed on children, often saying that youth are exposed to content that's a little bit too sensitive, that's not developmentally appropriate. And, the time commitment, the pressure can be challenging. What we've found, though, is that there are a lot of benefits. And the reality is that language brokering is not a choice for many newcomer families in Canada.
When you're talking about something that's age appropriate, I mean, how old are the children that we're talking about here? I imagine the ages are widely varied, but I mean, are kids as young as 7 years old interpreting for their parents?
Yes, that's right. I think majority of our participants were teenagers. The youngest one, if I'm not mistaken, were around 12. But I know that Anusha, in her other studies, she came across even younger children, as young as 7, 8 years old, who would be translating in different contexts.
I witnessed this firsthand when we supported a family coming to seek refuge in Canada who had 3 young children under 10. And very quickly, they started to broker, not just in their spaces and their new schools, new neighborhoods, but even with us as the host family sometimes.
And you said that there's a significant cultural component to this. I imagine that there is. So I imagine that adds an extra layer of difficulty for the children because you're not only translating the words, but you're sort of translating the meaning when it's something that's unfamiliar for your parents, or it's unfamiliar for the people who are trying to help your parents or trying to provide a service.
Absolutely, that's right. We also have to remember that some concepts might not even have a proper translation. We know that, for instance, the concept of mental health doesn't have a translation in certain cultures. So all of these things, the children, not only that they have to learn the vocabulary pretty quickly and get acquainted with, the terminology, but also be able to broker the context for their parents and explain it in a way that they can understand. I recently actually spoke to somebody who said, I couldn't really say it the way I'm saying it to you. I had to come up with stories, right? Because the culture is very story-based. So they had to find a way to create literally a little stories to explain to the parents of what the context of the situation was. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for the parent to even understand in their own language what it meant.
And I think that also comes with not everyone arrives at the same time when it comes to immigration. But presumably, if we're talking about a family that's arriving at the same time, well, the children, the teens, the young adults, the parents, grandparents, whoever is involved in the transition, they're all learning a new system. And so it's not just like translating the content or the meaning of this is what your test results say, but also navigating like, how do we go visit a doctor here? How do you make an appointment? How do you show up at the office? What's the process? And so there's a lot of acculturation involved, I suppose.
I think one of the examples that comes to mind that I experienced as a newcomer to Canada as well, but it came up in one of the interviews that we did, is credit card system. Not every countries are using credit cards, right? In Europe, I'm from Europe, we actually use debit cards everywhere. So the concept of, oh, do you want to apply for visa, is really something that it took me a while to understand what it even means. And we had a participant who was in Walmart. And you know how you pay at Walmart and they ask you a lot of questions like, do you want a shopping bag? Do you want to donate? Do you want this? So the child is translating all these questions that the sales associate has. And one of the question was, would you like to apply for Walmart visa? The parent didn't understand what it is. And the child by that time was quite irritated. So they were just pushing the parent into, oh, just take it, it's okay, just take it. So the parent took the visa, but somehow the parent had doubt, so they called Walmart customer care, and they were able to speak with the representative in French, because this was a French-speaking family. And eventually in French, the parent was able to understand what Walmart visa is, so they canceled the card right away. But the parent was actually telling us at the interview that, I totally understand that for the child, it's a stressful situation, and she probably didn't even understand what the visa means, right? Mm-hmm. So I made a decision in 30 seconds that could heavily impact my life, because of course, if you don't know what credit card is and that you have to pay on time and how to pay for it and all that, it can actually have a very negative consequences. So those are situations that these parent-child or guardian-child dyads are navigating every day, and it's not always very straightforward and easy.
I remember when I first went to university, there were always the kiosks set up that offered the credit card that you could apply for. And being a very poor university student, they would offer you like a bag of cookies or a box of generic soda that you could take with you if you applied for. And I applied for every credit card that I walked by because I thought, I just need that bag of cookies. It's going to get me through to the end of this week. It's going to help out. And so I would write down that I made $0, hoping that I wouldn't get approved for the credit card. And that, and then I found out much later on that had ruined my credit score. And I was an English-speaking person who I thought was fairly, had some wherewithal about me, and yet I still had no idea how that system worked. And I imagine that it feels kind of predatory in a lot of ways. I imagine that a lot of the time that then the children are a buffer from the parents from being taken advantage of by a lot of this sort of thing where, people could take advantage of somebody who doesn't understand exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I think our young participants tell us that, they have to grow up a little bit more quickly. They have to gain some maturity, gain some comfort and confidence with the language, because they are in a position where not just they have to help their family, but they want to. They recognize that. I think most participants talked about the fact that they recognized how difficult the immigration process was, how much their family sacrificed for them to have opportunities here. And so when the brokering was done in a more positive way or in a more supportive way, they did see it as a way of giving back to their family and as a way of supporting the entire system. Because if the whole family was functioning well, then each individual was functioning well, and vice versa.
Is there a generational translation that needs to take place as well? I'm thinking of my own daughter, who will say to me something like, oh, that slaps like W.C. Fields at Comic-Con. And I'll go, what are you talking about? And then she'll say, oh, Well, it would make total sense to you if you were in the My Little Pony, Bram Stoker's Dracula fan fiction message boards that I am, or whatever. And I'll go, I don't understand what those words mean together. There's a generational gap that I don't get. It's so fragmented for youth because they are in a, Bram Stoker's Dracula, W.C. Fields fan fiction group or whatever. Is that a huge issue now that you guys see with?
I feel you on that one. Every day I'm learning new things from my kids. Today was picture day, and my son's like, "Oh, Jasmine, your outfit's so drip," and we're all like, "Huh?" Even the older teenager didn't know what that meant. Honestly, I don't know how much our participants got into pop culture nuances, generational aspects like you're talking about. Katerina, maybe you can recall something more, but I feel like the situation is so dire sometimes, not to paint it all negative, but we're talking about like basic transitions, navigating systems, figuring out how to go to school, how to see a doctor, what to do if you get a parking ticket and you don't understand what it says on it. So those pieces are so important because they can have negative consequences. That from what I recall has been more of the focus for our participants rather than these nuances. I think when they get into these nuances, then that's probably a good thing because they're integrating into their environment a little bit more. I'm taking some liberties there, but I'd be curious to know what you think, Katerina.
I do recall it was not part of the research, the data collection stage, but as part of the child language brokering project that we've been working on since, I think, 2018, if I'm not mistaken. We did a lot of program delivery and services that were part of the bigger scope. Some of it were with workshops with the families. So the child and the parent or guardian would be together, and we were trying to prep them for these situations, maybe, increase the self-confidence of both, encourage their communication skills. And I know what came out there from the parents sometimes, that they struggle with the cultural transition because their child is becoming Canadian, while they are trying to hold on to their traditional values. And the child kind of doesn't understand the values. You know what I mean? If you come into a country when you're young, then you adopt the traditions, values, and the culture of the country where you grow up, right? But the parents, because they didn't speak English very well, their integration process and understanding of the culture that they moved into was slower than the children's. So all of a sudden, these cultural norms started clashing. So the parent didn't understand why my child is dressing like that. Why my child wants to go out with their friends to see a movie on Friday night, because in their culture, maybe it would not be appropriate, or mixing female and males. So these types of things would come up, and the parents would reach out to us trying to find ways to navigate that space of how to support their children, but at the same time, how to make their children understand where they are coming from, right? Because the way the parents think is also heavily influenced by their original culture, which the child doesn't understand anymore. This is a very complex thing. I hope it makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And I'm thinking, you said earlier, some of the kids prefer to speak English, presumably because they are in the Canadian culture and their friends speak English, and that's how they are able to get by and communicate. But I imagine, language is such an important part of culture. And I imagine that there's some worry on the part of parents too, of the kids losing the language that they grew up with, that that language can slowly disappear. I was reading somewhere that they think that within 30 years, English will be such a dominant language across the world that we're going to lose something like 60% of the languages that are currently being spoken today, which is a significant concern culturally for a lot of people, I imagine. So does that factor into it? Is that something that you talk to people about?
It's definitely come up a lot, and there's so much variability. We're talking about language brokering as a process and immigration as a process, but there's so much diversity, so much intersectionality within the people we're talking about, right? And also things shift. So like years ago, when my family immigrated to Canada, the message was, do not speak your language at home. If you want your children to learn English, or in my case, French, you have to speak to them in that language. We know now, years later, that that is actually not true at all, and that bilingualism, trilingualism is actually very good for brain development and becomes an asset for folks. But when it comes to, priorities and necessities post-immigration, focusing on English language learning or French language learning or both, it gets a lot of attention because it's tied to grades in school, it's tied to functioning in society. And then, again, if the kiddos are quite young, they've had less exposure to their heritage language, and so potentially less time and spaces to practice it. And then I think it's very individual how much certain families want to preserve that language versus others who are more open to kind of adjusting and letting go of certain traditions. But certainly, even when folks really want to hold on to their culture and language, I would say there's so much pressure to kind of integrate into the system, function well, and then that means less bandwidth to focus on your core values and language.
I remember as part of child language brokering study, we were identifying helpful factors, so factors that really help during the child language brokering process. Some of that Anusha mentioned, the sense of pride, empathy, creating bonds within families. And then we were also identifying hindering factors. And some of those were frustrations. And I recall some participants were actually saying that one of the frustrations they have when they translate for their parents is they're forgetting the wording in their first language. So they speak English, they try to speak English as much as they can to, integrate quickly, to get better in school, to get those grades, to be able to go to the university, but that somehow hinders their own first language capacity. And when they are in the, translation situation, they cannot remember the words in their first language. So the participants would say that really causes them a lot of stress and frustration with themselves, that they are forgetting the words. And then the parent would try to help them explain it to me in different ways so they can kind of get back to that first language. But it's definitely a challenge for the families, and it's I would say the process of obtaining the language proficiency but not losing the first language proficiency. It's something that the participants have to deal with quite often.
I imagine it's something you have to be mindful of. I remember years ago, I worked with a tourism campaign and we went across Canada and visited every province, and we spent a long time in Quebec. So for about a month and a half, I spoke nothing but French. And then I noticed even, the next few days when we moved into Nova Scotia or we went into Newfoundland, that I would have French phrases that just came into my regular speaking out of nowhere, and I would think, okay, what actually is that in English? Certain things that you've said often enough over the past month and a half that now it's just part of your vocabulary. And so I can imagine if that's every day, if that's you do that day in and day out at school, at home, at whatever job you might go to, that it becomes more and more difficult as time goes on.
Absolutely.
And Anusha, you mentioned the intersectionality of the population that you're working with, right? And newcomers, a ton of intersectionalities. And in your book, you made a point of talking about your own intersectionalities and how you had to factor those in when you were doing this study and realize where you guys were coming from. I think you used the word positionalities, which I didn't quite understand. I'm hoping you can tell me what positionalities means, and then tell me a little bit about how you reflect on that when you're putting this all together.
So we talk a lot about positionality when we do qualitative research so that we can identify who we are, how we think, and be able to, in some cases, depending on the type of research, set that aside a little bit to kind of meet your participants where they're at and really elicit their experience, their worldview, and not be leading in that capacity. There's a parallel to therapy that's copy paste to that, because again, the goals in therapy are not mine, they're my clients, and what I might consider healthy or unhealthy or appropriate or inappropriate based on my lived experience might be very different for my client, right? So it's just really this process of ongoing reflection and very intently being mindful of how you might be influencing your clients, your research participants. And I think I'll get back to the core of your question in a second, but I think when it comes to child language brokering, it really is incumbent on whoever is working with the newcomer families, whether that's a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a lawyer, to really be mindful of their own assumptions and to not make decisions for the family about what a child should and shouldn't do. Katerina and I talked about this recently. Parents who come to Canada, who are newcomers, who struggle a little bit with the language learning, also when they speak with a thick accent, they're not taken as seriously as maybe the way you and I would be when we're expressing ourselves. So there's a risk there that they lose some agency when the teacher or the doctor says, no, your child can't do this for you. Within, reasonable context, of course, but in some cases, the trust that a child has towards the trust that a parent has towards their child is very important and it's very meaningful in the whole process, rather than trusting an interpreter or a stranger. So I'm digressing a little bit, sorry, but I think I see a lot of folks who are trying to help newcomer families put their own assumptions and biases into the family as in terms of like what is appropriate or not appropriate. And I think families, for the most part, are in a position to decide what's most appropriate for them or not, because they know each other best. So even when we put together this book, Katerina and I have different immigration histories, backgrounds, positionalities, if you will. We had to think about how that might influence the research and our understanding of the research to make sure that we highlight the voices of participants in authentic ways and not kind of put our own slant or worldview on that.
All right, I realize that we are half an hour into this and haven't yet actually mentioned the book itself. So you've written this book. It's called Beyond Translation. How do you go from creating this study, doing this study, learning all the things that you do, exploring child language brokering to, you know what, we should turn this into a book? What is that process?
That's a very good question. I'm trying to recall when it happened and how it happened. I'm pretty sure it was over a coffee somewhere in a coffee shop, and we thought it's a brilliant idea until we actually started putting the book together. So it was a brilliant idea, but in fact, as I mentioned before, we've been working on child language brokering phenomena since 2018. We delivered multiple projects, also research studies. We got funding through different agencies. So it was kind of scattered all over the place. Some projects were through University of British Columbia, where Anusha is. Before that, Anusha was part of University of Calgary. So some projects were through UOC as well. Some of them were through the Immigrant Education Society. So we sat together and thought, look, it would be actually really beneficial to put it all together, because this child language brokering as a thing is so understudied. Even for us, it was so difficult to even find information about it in Canadian context. We found, of course, some articles from the United States, but even that was very specific to certain ethnicities. I believe the main focus in the States was on Chinese immigrants and immigrants from Latin America. So really getting, data and scientific evidence was really difficult. So we were thinking, we can write a paper, but actually by this time we have so much that it actually could be a book. So that's what I recall. Anusha, maybe you can fill me in.
Yes, it was one of those ideas that, I mean, it's still a great idea, but it was a lot of information to distill. It felt like it could be more cohesive in a book. And it also felt like it would be a great resource for anyone working with newcomer families, right? Settlement workers and agencies, cultural brokers in schools. And so having all of that information together, hopefully, will be helpful in terms of implementation. And yeah, it was a little labor of love because it was all done, after hours to be able to bring this to fruition. And, we're really looking at free resource for folks because it will be available as an open access publication through the library after a book launch. So that's really our intention, is to be able to share this information as widely as possible.
When that information does get shared, I'm a social worker in Grand Falls, New Brunswick, and I could really use some of the information that's in there. What do you hope that people will take from it?
So one of the things that the book includes are appendices. And as part of the appendices, we developed a lot of toolkits for settlement practitioners, for people who work with newcomer families and who found themselves in the language brokering situation. So this is definitely a resource they could be using, very practical resource that came out of one of the projects we did. And the chapters, I believe we have 2 chapters focusing on practitioners. They actually are a great addition and explanation of the resources that we developed. That's what came to me. But Anusha, please go ahead.
I think that's great, that practical application, what the CEO of TIES would call real-time research. That's her tagline. She wants us to translate our data into practical solutions for newcomers as fast as possible. And I really hope that folks can rethink their assumptions or their perceptions about this idea of children brokering for adults, because it really is a necessity for newcomer families. And that speaks to a systemic failure in terms of not providing enough supports, French and English and beyond, for folks across the country. And so if this is going to happen, then let's help families do it well, and let's help promote relationships and healthy communication throughout the process.
Excellent. Well, maybe this can serve also, yes, as a call to improving those resources in both official languages wherever they're most needed. You did mention in the book some of the limitations of the workshops that you've done and so on, in that you've worked with these very specific populations, English, French, Arabic, and that it doesn't necessarily translate to someone else who's coming in from a different circumstance, as you said, right? Such a wide variety of newcomers to Canada with such a wide variety of experiences. And I saw that there was a workshop in your book. It was about the best practices for, I think it was emotional wellness in the context of child language brokering. So you did come up with a few things that seem to really work. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about those that, maybe a little more universal.
Definitely, as a psychologist, there's a psychological aspect to all of the research that we do. But being mindful of the emotional wellness, that's what the term we used in that part of the book, but really being mindful of the psychosocial development of everyone involved in the language brokering process. It's not just protecting children, which is incredibly important, but it's protecting everyone involved in the process so that they can transition as well as possible into their new environment. So certainly, like, open communication, preparing children ahead of time, clear guidelines, having a plan in place, that is usually helpful versus, oh, hey, we just got a phone call, jump on and let's do the translation. that can increase anxiety, stress, and then the process isn't as smooth. So planning is really helpful. And I think working with cultural brokers in different spaces, whether that's in the settlement agency, in the school system, the medical system might not have as many cultural brokers, but trying to get as many supports on board as possible so that there isn't a power struggle happening between the newcomer family and whoever they're trying to communicate with.
I just wanted to add that we also worked with the parents and kind of trained them in how to praise their children and really explain to them that if they are patient and supportive during the process, that it will be much easier for the child. So things like, you did a good job, thank you so much. I really appreciate your help. This helps the entire family, these types of things. So that proved to be very efficient as well.
Beyond Translation, exploring child language brokering in Alberta's culturally diverse landscape is available now. There's a link to that and more resources in today's show notes. Thanks to Dr. Anusha Kassan and Katerina Palova for joining me for today's episode, and to you at home for listening, streaming, downloading, and reviewing this show. Mindful is written, published, and hosted by me, Eric Bowman, and produced and edited by Ottawa's own Jamie Montgomery. Our theme music is Avenues by Toronto's own David Taylor.